On January 30th, Practical Task released a video called Melee Controller Ruleset Proposal. This video officialized the box nerfs which have been in the works for several years. For context, I'll play the first minute of the video.
Hi, my name is Practical Task, and I would like to talk about controllers. Over the last several years, the Melee community has seen the introduction of a wide variety of custom controllers, including both hardware mods to the standard GameCube controller form factor, as well as the rise of leverless, also known as rectangle or box controllers. Many controller manufacturers understand that their devices are capable of significantly better performance relative to even the best OEM GameCube controllers, and so willingly nerf their devices. Many tournaments, however, have little or no regulation on these controllers besides what the manufacturers and players self-impose, other than limitations on macros. This has led to an uneasy arms race, where manufacturers wish to release the best controller possible, and players wish to use those controllers, but nobody wants to push too far too quickly and risk tournament organizers drawing a black and white line in the current gray area to ban some or all of these controllers. This situation has slowly become untenable, so my team and I have been working to outline acceptable and unacceptable configurations for all third-party controllers in the form of a rule set. This rule set seeks to modernize Melee's controller rules and level the playing field for all controller types. As of the release of this video, this process is complete and the rule set has been submitted to major tournament organizers for review.
After the release of this video, several top players rejoiced at the fact that the box was being nerfed. The announcement was almost unanimously regarded as a positive change for the game among those with influence. However, there were a subset of box users who mentioned how miserable these gameplay changes actually feel. Whenever this divide happens, box players tend to get drowned out within the discussion simply because they don't have as much influence. Those who disapprove of the nerfs don't have the leverage that's needed to sway the community, and so this creates the illusion that the nerfs are a good thing. Today I'll be weighing in on why I firmly believe these box nerfs are a mistake. If you're a fan of this kind of Melee content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I've also provided a recap at the end of the video for those who are short on time. Something I should mention from early on in the video is that the recommended solution I'll be suggesting today is different from anything I proposed before in that it is much more minimalistic. I encourage the community to review this video in full and to consider how much lower risk my recommended solution is as compared to a firmware update which overhauls the box considerably. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. To start things off, I'd like to highlight the most problematic aspect of the clip from Practical Task's video that I just showed.
Many tournaments, however, have little or no regulation on these controllers besides what the manufacturers and players self-impose, other than limitations on macros. This has led to an uneasy arms race, where manufacturers wish to release the best controller possible, and players wish to use those controllers, but nobody wants to push too far too quickly and risk tournament organizers drawing a black and white line in the current gray area to ban some or all of these controllers.
I'm highlighting this clip because something I must assure is that the box was designed in entirely good faith. When Practical Task references certain brands pushing the limits of what's legal within the scope of the rule set, I believe this is in reference to the fact that certain brands removed the Smash DI and Pivot Tilts nerfs. I agree that the community should have prohibited those brands from doing this, however the box has always had those two nerfs intact. As Practical Task's video shows, the box contains obscure nerfs such as Y-tilt plus greater than 50 degrees. For those who don't know what Y-tilt plus greater than 50 degrees is, this is in reference to the coordinates which can be used to perform turnaround tilts or fall from the ledge without fast falling. Because these coordinates don't touch the rim, the box has much better accuracy over pinpointing them, which is why they ought to be banned. Back when I designed the box in 2017 to 2018, I insisted that every aspect of its in-game capabilities needed to be nerfed. The community was generally shocked at how far I went when it came to nerfing the box, but I assured that this was the necessary approach in the long term. To recall where this design philosophy originated, it all started with disagreements between me and the Hitbox team. Some may remember that I was even accused of theft after my decision to part ways with Hitbox and design my own digital controller iteration. However, I was able to prove that this wasn't theft in the slightest. I had tried my hardest to advise Hitbox that the goal of creating the strongest possible controller would fail in the long term, as the community surely wouldn't allow a digital controller with perfect angles and other overpowered features. By mid-2017, I had come to the realization that not all in-game balance could be achieved firmware-side. There were certain GameCube controller improvements which needed to be given as well. I came forward to the community about this on June 9, 2017. Within the video I released on that day, I explained that buffs such as 100% dashback needed to be standardized in order for the box to be legal. This piqued the interest of other community leaders almost immediately. Just 3 days later, for example, Practical Task tweeted a sentiment which expressed agreement with standardizing 100% dashback. Behind the scenes, a group of community leaders quickly assimilated to discuss these gameplay changes. Within these discussions, I had a very different approach from the rest of the people I was working with. I advised that less well-known mechanics such as 1.0 Cardinal and dash out of crouch needed to be addressed, and I suggested that our team had an obligation to continuously discover new mechanics and educate the community on them. This was very similar to the advice I gave the Hitbox team around this time period in the sense that I was thinking long-term. Unfortunately, the rest of the team I was working with didn't have the long-term in mind. There was a rush to standardize some type of mod in time for Shine 2017 in particular, as the tournament organizer for that event had expressed that he was willing to experiment. This was what led to the release of UCF.
Universal Controller Fix is thoroughly tested and endorsed by some of the most knowledgeable and reputable Melee modders, including Typo, Cardano, and Taucon. UCF is a set of codes that allows any controller to perform just as well as what you'd consider the perfect GameCube controller to be. The mod doesn't make any techniques easier, and it does not enable players to perform actions differently from how they used to. Instead, the changes only let you do what's possible with a perfect controller in vanilla Melee. To reiterate once more, the focus of UCF is to turn any controller into a good controller, without going beyond what is normally possible in vanilla Melee.
Within the UCF reveal video, I was able to recognize issues which wouldn't have been apparent to others at the time. Most notably, the claim that UCF didn't make the game easier was untrue. UCF did in fact make the game easier by increasing dashback's window to 2 frames and widening shield drop's range, and so the UCF team was being disingenuous by claiming otherwise. Furthermore, if we look at the direction UCF has taken in more recent years, updates such as version 0.84 have only steered the mod in the direction I originally advocated for. As of version 0.84, which was released in 2022, UCF has included fixes for 1.0 Cardinal and dash out of crouch. I had already been advocating for these fixes for 5 years by that point. I'm showing this in order to establish that despite being outnumbered within the discussions that occurred in 2017, I was always the one with the long term in mind. In the Box Manifesto, which I published in 2018, I included a full chapter which outlined the long-term problems with UCF. The chapter generally explained the consequences which would inevitably manifest as a result of me losing jurisdiction over the Community Standardized Software mod. The Community Standardized Software mod was intended to level the playing field between the GameCube controller and box, but the UCF team didn't care about the box at all. With the mod now in the hands of a team that didn't have the correct rationale in mind, the community would inevitably run into problems down the road. Those problems have, in my opinion, manifested as of Practical Task's recent ruleset proposal, which I will now be revisiting.
Second, Swift has graciously agreed to provide his perspective on the parts of the ruleset that impact leverless controllers. I'm very grateful for the time and effort he's taken to test our firmware, provide his feedback, and contribute to this video.
Hi, my tag is Swift, and I've been asked to help explain the new box ruleset made by PTAS and his team of controller modders. I'm not personally a part of that team, but I've been playtesting the new firmware and following its development for almost 2 years now. I think they did a really good job and that this will be a very positive thing for the community. Digital controllers would have probably gotten banned as a whole if it weren't for the nerfs, so I think this is also in the best interest of digital controller players as well. Goal with the nerfs is to bring digital controllers to a level more on par with GameCube controllers. I think even with the nerfs, digital controllers still offer some advantages over normal GameCube controllers. From a player's perspective, it feels more difficult to use and it takes a bit of getting used to. I still feel like I can play the same way, but I have to earn certain things a bit more, and a lot of the egregious box stuff has been toned down, more to the level of a GameCube controller.
The first aspect of this clip that I have to criticize is the decision to defer to Swift as the box playtester. With all due respect to Swift, he was not involved in the making of the box, and so this in itself is a red flag. On April 12, 2024, I privately asked Practical Task if my career status had anything to do with his decision to exclude me from ruleset-related discussions. He assured me that I had not been treated any differently from other large-scale manufacturers, and he clarified that all manufacturers had been excluded as to avoid monetary incentive from influencing the discussion. However, this was all very troubling to me because I'm the person who single-handedly designed the box's intellectual property. As I expressed earlier on in the video, I designed the box in purely good faith and without any monetary incentive. From there, other manufacturers actually made the mistake of removing the Smash DI and Pivot Tilts nerfs after cloning the box blueprint, which only made things harder for me. The fact that Practical Task failed to make the distinction that Box is the brand which laid down the groundwork for the intellectual property was very troubling. Just based on this alone, it shouldn't come as a surprise that I do not agree with any of Practical Task's changes to the box. If we go back to Practical Task's video, there's an immediate problem I'd like to highlight before I get into any of the actual nerfs. Right off of the bat, Practical Task and Swift have both jumped to the conclusion that the only way to balance the box further is to nerf it. The possibility that buffing the GameCube controller is the better solution is not mentioned or considered anywhere in Practical Task's video. This will come into play later. Without further ado, let's jump into the nerfs that are listed.
Okay, so I have two controllers here. This box is not nerfed, and this prism is nerfed. So I'm going to use the two to compare. So the first thing that we'll talk about is SOCD. And SOCD basically refers to what happens when you're holding opposite directions down on the controller. So say if I'm holding left and then I press right, what's going to happen? If I press down, then I'm pressing up. So currently, box controllers have it set to a mode called second input priority, which has it so that whatever your second input is going to completely override your initial movement button, and you're going to move that direction. So basically, I'm holding left, and then I press right, and then it'll just cancel out and make me move right. So this makes movement a lot more lenient, and it's part of why box players move around much quicker in general than controller players. And also opens the door like a really easy way to ledge dash by using the SOCD. There you go. Neutral SOCD will now be what's required. So if you're holding down one direction and you press the opposite direction, they'll both cancel each other out. This requires a bit more deliberate inputs for the player, and it puts more skill into quickly changing directions.
I'll be explaining some of the flaws and oversights that are present in the nerfs from Practical Task's video. For starters, Swift states that a really easy way to ledge dash is by using the SOCD. This implies that inputting back then forward to ledge dash is no longer possible once neutral SOCD is enforced. However, this is not the case. A box player can simply bypass the nerf during ledge dashing by ledge falling with the C-stick, then holding forward and jumping. To show you what I mean, Swift explained that once neutral SOCD is enforced, you can no longer press back then forward to ledge fall, then jump toward the stages easily. He is correct about this. However, a box player can still ledge fall with the C-stick, then hold forward and jump. This means that neutral SOCD creates a massive quality of life hindrance on the box in that it incentivizes an unergonomic input sequence. Neutral SOCD doesn't actually nerf anything when it comes to ledge dashing, it just forces you to use a less comfortable motion. I was aware of this during the box development phase, and I ultimately concluded that neutral SOCD couldn't be enforced because of it, as a nerf fails to serve its purpose if a way to bypass it exists. Furthermore, I don't believe that neutral SOCD actually shifts the overall power level of the controller. With enough practice, you'll probably find that you can dash dance just as well with neutral SOCD, and so it's more of an annoyance than an actual nerf.
This grid represents the analog stick of a GameCube controller. Analog controllers are at the mercy of polling in that the game can pull the controller while a player is moving their stick. For example, if I'm moving my stick over here, I'm physically putting my stick over all of these values in between. And in that time, the game can pull my controller when it's somewhere over here or here. Box controllers don't have this. They just go from here and then warp to their desired value. This makes digital controllers quicker and more precise than GameCube controllers. The solution to this is a simulated travel time. When you move the control stick with the digital button, instead of the output instantly jumping to the target coordinate, the controller must output a series of values that sweep from the initial location to the target location over the course of 6 to 12 milliseconds. That way, the game has the same chance of pulling your controller at one of these intermediate values, similar to a GameCube controller.
Next are my criticisms for travel time. The first criticism I have for travel time is that it only applies travel time to the directional buttons, not the action buttons, and so in that regard it makes the directional buttons feel different to use. Keep in mind that the directional buttons and the action buttons normally feel the same to a box user. The travel time nerf disrupts this in that only the directional buttons have an input delay. The other criticism I have for travel time is that it's the most extreme attempt to simulate the GameCube controller out of the three nerfs we'll be going over. However, it is still very far from a true simulation. On the other hand, buffing the GameCube controller actually does create a true simulation in the areas that are buffed. For example, if the GameCube controller is given 100% dashback, then both the GameCube controller and box will have 100% dashback. Neither controller has an advantage over the other at that point, and so there's exact parity. This is why buffing the GameCube controller is actually the true solution.
Next, I'm going to talk about input fuzzing. All of these little gray squares on this controller grid represent different values on the analog stick. Since there are so many of these tiny little areas so close to each other, it's basically impossible to consistently aim for the same specific coordinate over and over again. Trying to do so will result in you hitting all the coordinates around that area and sometimes hitting that same coordinate, but it's never consistent. Digital controllers don't have this problem. When digital controllers have a coordinate set, it is the exact same coordinate every single time. To account for this, the targeted coordinate will now be in the center of a 3x3 grid of coordinates that will be chosen at random. On the diagram here, the red is the target and the pink is the grid. The grid to the left represents the chance of each coordinate being output, with the target being the center. In the grand scheme of the entire controller, this range is so minor that it's not noticeable in normal gameplay while still preventing certain coordinate perfect tech.
Next, coordinate fuzzing is probably the change I despise the most on the box. For starters, coordinate fuzzing introduces true RNG to the box, and so it is not a replica of analog stick imprecision in any way. True RNG should always be avoided in a competitive setting, and so that alone is enough to veto coordinate fuzzing. However, there are a few more reasons as well. For one, there's nothing inherently wrong with being able to pinpoint a legal coordinate 100% of the time. The box is its own separate archetype with its own intricacies, and within that archetype, there's nothing unfair to worry about when it comes to perfect accuracy over legal coordinates. Finally, there's the fact that there's no way to rationalize the size of the surrounding coordinate grid. Practical Task's team has chosen a surrounding grid of 3x3. However, they could just as easily have chosen a grid of 5x5 or 7x7. Since there's no way to rationalize the size of the grid, coordinate fuzzing should be avoided altogether.
Next, I'll go over angle limitations. As it currently stands, there are no actual limitations for what angles a player can put on their controller. The rule set has made the cutoff for legal recovery angles 20 degrees. For context, the shortest angle possible on a GameCube controller is 17 degrees, while the default box angle is 23 degrees. The decision to not have the cutoff at the default 23 degrees was due to the common sentiment that edgeguarding digital controller players was much easier, and Firefox notches have become very prevalent in top-level play. There will also be an angle limitation on wave dashes, with the longest possible wave dash being 27 degrees. For context, the current default box wave dash is 30 degrees. Different characters sometimes prefer different wave dash angles, so two firmwares will be released, one with a 27 degree wave dash and one with a 30 degree wave dash. Due to fuzzing, you won't get the exact same angle each time, and the ranges of the longest to shortest wave dash length for both firmwares is on the right.
Finally, let's discuss the controller committee's decision to alter the box's air dodge and recovery angles. For one, I do not agree with the fact that the current rule set has not outlined clear restrictions on the angle limitations for box controllers. The box utilizes a 23 degree recovery angle and a 30.5 degree air dodge angle, both of which are chosen for very specific reasons. The 23 degree recovery angle stems from the fact that when you push the box's X value to the maximum legal value that teeters and then account for the 2 coordinate ban on some other techniques as well, an angle of 23 degrees is produced. From there, the air dodge angle of 30.5 degrees is chosen for different reasons. The main factor to consider when determining the appropriate air dodge angle is ledge dash behavior. Fox happens to need an air dodge angle of 30.5 degrees or shallower in order to perform a frame 6 ledge dash, and so I chose the weakest possible angle for him. Make no mistake, the rule set committee has actually buffed both the recovery and air dodge angles. Recovery has been improved to 20 degrees, and air dodge has been improved to 27 degrees. These are the most preposterous changes the rule set committee has made overall, as they potentially outweigh all of the nerfs the committee has given. To be clear, the entire box nerfs package may very well be a buff, as the 3 nerfs are for the most part quality of life hindrances which can be played around, whereas the angle changes are strictly buffs to the controller's strength. This change constitutes the most concrete proof that the rule set committee should not be allowed to modify the box, as with all due respect, they fail to underestimate the severity of these types of changes. That brings me to what I believe the correct solution actually is. As I've stressed throughout this video, the UCF team made a huge mistake back in 2017 when they condemned my long-term approach by fixing only 2 mechanics in their debut release. All signs point to the long-term approach I proposed back then being correct, with the best proof being UCF's decision to address 1.0 Cardinal and dash out of crouch on later versions. I'd been advising for those mechanics to be fixed ever since 2017, which is why I believe it would have been best to follow my advice from the start. In more recent years, I went on to work on a mod called 1.03 with my friend Altimore. Together, the two of us discovered all 13 faulty mechanics in the game. To show you how 1.03 compares to UCF 0.84, there are not only several brand new mechanics, but also improvements to 2 existing mechanics in Shield Drop and 1.0 Cardinal. Several of my previous videos have gone over the implications of the full 1.03 mod, but today I'll be keeping things more straightforward. Among the 1.03 mods, there are a few of them which stand out above the rest. These are the improved shield drop range, the vertical throws fix, the SDI remainder fix, and the ADT shield fix. I'll jump straight to the point by advising that these are the 4 mods which close the gap between the GameCube controller and box by the most. To briefly recap what these 4 mods are in reference to, here's a quick overview. On UCF 0.84, shield drop is improved from vanilla. However, it is still only a thin range along the rim. 1.03 increases this to a fully filled in quadrant for improved accuracy. On vanilla, the range for vertical throws is a thin up and down corridor. 1.03 increases this to a cone-shaped range, which is in line with the range that's used for up tilt and down tilt. On vanilla, smash DI can be stifled by polling. To be exact, it is possible for the initial smash DI input to generate as little as 70% magnitude. 1.03 addresses this by applying the remaining amount of smash DI on the subsequent frame, which ensures that you always have 100% magnitude. And finally, the ADT shield fix is in reference to the fact that it's possible for the GameCube controller to receive an ADT shield pull. This occurs when a light shield pull on frame 1 is followed by a digital shield pull on frame 2. Your shield will fail to protect you from physical attacks on frames 2 and 3 when this happens, which can never happen on the box. At this point, you might be worried that I'm going to advise for the full adoption of 1.03 as I've done in several of my previous videos. Rest assured, I'm not. I'm going to streamline things even further by highlighting only the 1.03 shield drop fix. The reason I'm highlighting this fix is because the Melee community unanimously agrees that dashback and shield drop are the 2 most important GameCube controller improvements. Even the UCF team suggests this on their website, which states that dashback and shield drop stand out above the rest. The reason this is significant is because the Melee community should be aware that shield drop was never fixed correctly on UCF. Whereas UCF's dashback fix is perfectly fine, its shield drop fix is not. Ever since the initial release of UCF, there's been a problem with shield drop in that its fixed version only extends down to the Y value of -0.7875. This Y value, which doesn't correspond with anything in-game, was chosen by Cardano simply because he felt that it was good enough to account for the majority of GameCube controllers. However, we should look to eliminate arbitrary values such as this one on our final rationale. There's nothing wrong with the fixed shield drop range spanning the entire rim, for example. This is what was used on some of the earlier versions of 1.03. Next, the UCF team introduced an upward range increase on version 0.84. This should explicitly be banned. The UCF team tampered with shield drop's actuation point by increasing its range upward, which they themselves compensated for with a 1-frame delay on these coordinates. However, this makes things even more messy for several reasons. For one, the decision to increase shield drop by specifically 4 Y values upward introduces yet another arbitrary value. From there, the belief that a 4 Y value increase corresponds with exactly a 1-frame delay in actuation time is arbitrary as well. For these reasons, this range increase should be avoided altogether. The next and final change that Altmore and I made to shield drop came on later versions of 1.03. Altmore and I eventually realized that shield drop's improved range didn't need to span the rim. Instead, it could be filled in. This makes shield drop resemble the rest of the out-of-shield options, those being roll, spot dodge, and tap jump. The 1.03 shield drop fix makes for a drastic improvement over UCF. On UCF, it is by all means still possible to fail a shield drop and unintentionally spot dodge instead. On 1.03, this is never possible due to the improved range. This creates true parity with the box's shield drop capabilities, as the box can automatically shield drop by holding down in conjunction with left or right. The reason I encourage the community to come around to buffing the GameCube controller further is because it achieves balance without compromising quality of life. As I showed earlier, there are many box users who are unfond of the nerfs. However, they don't have the platforms or the influence to contend the changes that are being made to their controller. I'm trying my best to steer things in the correct direction as to help these people out. Furthermore, buffing the GameCube controller closes the gap between the GameCube controller and box to a much greater degree than the suggestions Practical Task has made. GameCube controller users have expressed that the GameCube controller should by all means remain the best controller, as any alternative such as the box should only exist for ergonomic reasons. I'm very much so in agreement with this sentiment, which is why I'd like to revisit my assessment of Practical Task's changes. As I emphasized, the recovery and air dodge angle buffs that Practical Task has given the box are likely more than enough to negate or exceed the entire nerfs package, and so the nerfware fails to achieve its intended purpose. Meanwhile, the 1.03 mod that Altmore and I have developed more than likely makes the GameCube controller better than the box, as the box has some considerable disadvantages once these areas of the game have been equalized. To close things out, I'll provide a recap of this video. On January 30th, Practical Task released a video called Melee Controller Rule Set Proposal. This video officialized the box nerfs which had been in the works for several years. The announcement was almost unanimously regarded as a positive change for the game among top-level GameCube controller users with influence. However, there were a subset of box users who mentioned how miserable these gameplay changes actually feel. As the box developer, I foresaw that the community would make the mistake of adopting these types of nerfs ever since things went in a certain direction in 2017. Back in January 2017, I correctly vetoed Hitbox's Smashbox project. I advised Hitbox that their controller would end up getting banned in the long term, and that they needed to take the approach of applying as many in-game nerfs as possible. By June 2017, I had determined that the GameCube controller needed to be buffed in many areas as well. However, Practical Task and others incorrectly vetoed my software modding project and went on to create UCF. In the box manifesto, which I published in 2018, I explained that UCF had deviated from the software mod's true goals. While UCF was good enough for its time, its problems would inevitably emerge. As the years passed, this prediction came true. UCF was eventually forced to adapt by adding fixes for 1.0 Cardinal and Dash Out of Crouch, which I'd been advising for ever since 2017. Unfortunately, the community has entrusted Practical Task and a separate rule set committee to standardize a new set of firmware-side box nerfs, each of which intrude on quality of life in some way. I'll go over some of the issues with each of them. First is neutral SOCD. The main issue I have with the neutral SOCD nerf is that it incentivizes an unergonomic input sequence for ledge dashing. The box user can bypass this nerf during ledge dashing by ledge falling with the C-stick. However, that's uncomfortable in comparison to ledge falling with back. Additionally, I do not believe that neutral SOCD nerfs anything meaningfully. The clunkiness caused by neutral SOCD can be overcome with enough skill, and so it fails to shift the overall power level of the controller. Second is travel time. The first issue I have with travel time is that it makes the directional buttons feel different to use than the action buttons, since the input delay is only applied to the directional buttons. The other criticism is that travel time is the most extreme attempt to simulate the GameCube controller. However, it fails to create true parity, as digital buttons with travel time applied still aren't the same as an analog stick. Meanwhile, buffing the GameCube controller through software mods such as 100% dashback actually does create true parity with the box. This is largely why buffing the GameCube controller is a solution the community should look towards. Finally, coordinate fuzzing is the most distasteful change of all, as it adds true RNG to the box. While the intention here is to replicate the imprecision of an analog stick, true RNG is not the same thing at all and should always be avoided in a competitive setting. There's also the fact that there is nothing inherently wrong with being able to pinpoint a legal coordinate 100% of the time. Lastly, there is no way to rationalize the size of the surrounding grid for coordinate fuzzing. The controller committee chose 3x3, but they could have just as easily chosen 5x5 or 7x7. For this reason alone, coordinate fuzzing should be avoided altogether. Now, to make matters worse, there is the fact that the controller committee actually buffed the box's recovery and air dodge angles by several degrees each. This change shouldn't be underestimated, as it more than likely exceeds the reduction in strength that is caused by the committee's nerfs. Conclusively, the committee's nerfed firmware can be viewed as an overall buff mixed with several quality of life hindrances. Box users are bound to be unfond of these changes, as they make the controller feel clunky while also making it less balanced. I'm very confident that the true solution is the 1.03 mod that I've developed with Altimore in more recent years. 1.03 is the evolution of my controller modding project from 2017 in that it addresses all of the faulty mechanics in the game, not just the most mainstream ones. As compared to UCF, the 1.03 mechanics that have the most impact are the improved shield drop range, the vertical throws fix, the smash DI remainder fix, and the ADT shield fix. At this point, I know from experience that the community will not adopt the full 1.03 at this time, and so I will not be advising for it. Instead, I would like to bring attention to the improved shield drop range specifically. The improved shield drop range is significant because dashback and shield drop are widely regarded as the two most important mechanics to fix. Whereas UCF's dashback fix is fine, however, shield drop was never fixed correctly. UCF increases shield drop by 8 Y values in the downward direction, which is arbitrary as compared to spanning the entire rim. From there, UCF 0.84 increases shield drop by 4 Y values in the upward direction, which should be illegal since it tampers with the actuation time. Finally, shield drop never should have been made to span the rim specifically, as the inner range can be filled in as well. Once all of these aspects of the shield drop fix are addressed, shield drop is made to resemble the rest of the out-of-shield options. Here's another look at the diagram for reference. The single best move for the community is to halt the nerfed box firmware and instead standardize the shield drop fix I just described. To be clear, this means that UCF 0.84 can continue to be used, with the only alteration being the new shield drop range. Perhaps this version could be titled UCF.85 as to indicate a marginal update. The goal of this approach is to shatter the stigma that the remaining gameplay changes which are needed are box firmware side, and to redirect the attention to the shortcomings of UCF. The shield drop changes that I've outlined are the best way to do this because the community has already agreed to fix this mechanic, but it was never fixed correctly. The improved shield drop range on 1.03 tends to be one of the most well-received changes among those who've tested it because it truly modernizes the mechanic. If the shield drop change is well received on a larger scale, then further changes can be discussed at a later date. However, this is the most important change for now. Conclusively, what I urge GameCube controller users to understand is that the goal ought to be to balance the box without compromising its quality of life. The approach I've outlined in this video is very low risk and has a high likelihood of shifting people's perspective on the matter, and so I strongly recommend it. Thank you to those who've considered what I've had to say in this video. As part of an ongoing effort to educate Melee players about the benefits of buffing the GameCube controller, I'll be releasing another video next week. As I mentioned within this video, a few of the GameCube controller buffs stand out above the rest. I personally believe that the ADT shield fix is one of the most important fixes on 1.03 overall, as it fixes more issues with the GameCube controller than people may realize. I'll be explaining everything in my next video, so stay tuned.